The smell hit Martha Anderson before she even opened the kitchen door that February morning in 1953. Not smoke, exactly, but something darker, sharper, the kind of smell that makes your stomach drop before your mind catches up. She pushed through the doorway from the sleeping porch, where the temperature hovered just above freezing, and there it was, a thin grey wisp curling up from behind the massive cast-iron cookstove that dominated the west wall of her Iowa farmhouse kitchen. Her husband, Tom, was already out in the barn doing the 5 o'clock milking with their oldest boy, 16-year-old Robert. Their 3 younger children, still asleep upstairs, had no idea their mother was standing frozen in her nightgown and wool robe, watching what could become the end of everything they owned. Martha's hand shook as she grabbed the flashlight from the shelf. The pre-dawn darkness made it hard to see, but when she knelt down and shone the beam behind the stove, her worst fear crystallized into certainty. The wooden wall behind the cookstove, the wall that should have been at least 8 inches away from the cast-iron back panel, was nearly touching the metal. And where the wall met the stove, the wood had turned black, charred, hot to the touch even now. Another few hours of cooking breakfast, heating water, keeping the kitchen warm, and this whole house could have gone up like kindling. They had moved into this place just 6 months ago, taking over the mortgage from Martha's uncle, who could no longer farm after his stroke. It was supposed to be their fresh start, their chance to build something after years of renting land and living in somebody else's houses. The banknote was due every month without fail. They had 40 head of dairy cattle, 200 chickens, and every cent they could scrape together was tied up in keeping this operation running through the winter. A house fire would destroy them completely. The worst part was, Martha knew better. She had grown up on her family's farm just 20 miles south of here, and her mother had drilled it into her head from childhood. Never let a wood stove sit flush against a wall. Always leave space. Always. Her mother's own aunt had lost 3 children in a farmhouse fire back in 1927, and the story had haunted Martha's family like a ghost ever since. Yet somehow, in the chaos of moving and getting the farm operational before winter set in, she had never thought to check behind the stove in this kitchen. She stood up slowly, her knees protesting against the cold floor. Tom would be in from milking within the hour. She needed to show him immediately. No fire in the cookstove today. They would use the kerosene heater in the corner for warmth and figure out cold breakfast. But that charred wall behind the stove, that was a crisis that couldn't wait. When Tom came stamping through the mud porch an hour later, his boots caked with frozen manure and his face red from the cold wind, Martha was ready with coffee made on the kerosene burner and a flashlight in her hand. "We have a problem," she said, and the tone of her voice made him set down the milk pails without a word. She showed him the charred wall. Tom knelt there for a long time, running his calloused fingers over the blackened wood, measuring the gap with his hand, checking how hot the wall still felt. When he finally stood up, his face was grey. "Jesus, Martha," he said quietly, glancing toward the stairs where the children were starting to stir. "Another week and we would have had a fire." "I know. We have to move the stove today." Martha felt relief wash through her, grateful he understood immediately. But then reality set in. How? That thing weighs at least 300 pounds, maybe 400. And even if we move it, we need to rebuild that section of wall. The wood's compromised. Tom rubbed his face with both hands. He was 34 years old, but looked older lately, worn down by the constant pressure of making this farm work. "I'll call Harold," he said finally. Harold Bjornsson farmed the next section over and was the kind of neighbor you could count on in a crisis. And maybe Gene Hutchins. Between the 4 of us men, we can slide that stove out. But the wall, we need someone who knows what they're doing. "County Extension Agent," Tom said, making the decision. "Frank Morrison. He came out last month about the drainage issue in the lower 40. Good man. He'll know the proper way to set up a stove clearance." Their party line telephone, shared with 5 other farm families, opened for business at 7 o'clock. Until then, they had to wait. Tom went back out to finish the barn work, and Martha got the children up and fed them cold cereal and toast, made by holding bread over the kerosene heater with a fork. 8-year-old Susan asked why Mama wasn't cooking on the big stove like usual, and Martha said simply that it needed repairs. No point frightening the little ones. At 7:03, Tom cranked the telephone handle and asked the operator to connect him to Harold Bjornsson. Within 20 minutes, Harold and his grown son Lars were pulling into the yard in their Ford pickup. At 7:20, Tom got through to Frank Morrison at the county extension office. Frank arrived by 9 o'clock, a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and a leather satchel full of pamphlets and measuring tools. He took one look behind the stove and let out a low whistle. "You folks are lucky," he said bluntly, "real lucky. I've seen farmhouses burned to the foundation over exactly this kind of situation." He pulled out a measuring tape and started documenting distances, talking as he worked. "This stove's a Monarch, probably 1940 or so. Cast iron back panel gets up to 500 degrees, maybe 600 when you're really cooking. Wood ignites at around 450 degrees. You had maybe 1.5 inches of clearance here. That's nowhere near enough." "How much do we need?" Harold asked. "Minimum 6 inches from the wall, 8 is better, and the wall itself should be protected. Asbestos board or metal sheeting behind the stove with an air gap so heat can dissipate instead of building up." Martha felt her throat tighten. They had been sleeping upstairs every night above a kitchen that was slowly charring its way toward catastrophe. The children had been sleeping up there. "We need to move it now," she said. "Agreed," Frank said. "Let's get this stove out, let that wall cool down completely, then we'll fix it right." The 4 men spent the next 2 hours disconnecting the stovepipe, emptying the remaining wood and ash, and carefully sliding the massive cookstove away from the wall. They used heavy quilts underneath to protect the linoleum floor and moved it inch by inch, Martha and Robert watching anxiously. When they finally got it clear, the full extent of the damage became obvious. A section of wall about 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall was charred black. In 2 places, the wood had actually begun to smolder itself into shallow depressions. If the stove had been running at full heat for a big Sunday dinner or heating water for laundry, this wall would have caught fire. There was no question about it. "How long do we have before it would have caught?" Tom asked, his voice tight. Frank ran his hand over the deepest char mark. "Days, maybe. A week at most if you were running the stove hard. You caught this just in time." Robert, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Why didn't the people who lived here before know about this? Why was the stove set up wrong?" "Could be a dozen reasons," Frank said. "Maybe they moved the stove at some point and didn't think about clearance. Maybe the house settled on its foundation and everything shifted. Maybe it was always wrong and they just got lucky for years. But that's the thing about fire. It doesn't care about luck. Eventually, it catches up." Tom looked at the damaged wall and then at Martha. "How much to fix this right?" Frank did quick calculations. Lumber, asbestos board, metal sheeting, supplies, about $10 total. You do the labor yourself. $10 was half a week's milk check. It was groceries for a week. But it was also their lives, their children, their future. Martha saw Tom doing the math, weighing cost against necessity. "We'll do it," Tom said. "Today. I can't have my family in this house another night with that wall like that." They spent the rest of the morning ripping out the damaged section. The charred wood came away easily, revealing the 2x4 studs underneath. 2 of the studs showed char damage as well, so they replaced those with fresh lumber that Harold happened to have in his barn. By noon, Martha served them hot soup and sandwiches, heated carefully on the kerosene burner. My grandmother's place had the cook stove sitting on a brick platform right in the middle of the kitchen, Harold said as they ate. She used to say her father built it that way after a neighbor family lost their house to a stove fire. This would have been back around 1890. "Smart man," Frank said. "If you've got the space, putting a cook stove where air can circulate all around it is safest, but most kitchens aren't big enough, so you put it against a wall and make damn sure there's proper clearance." The old-timers knew this instinctively, but somewhere along the way that knowledge got lost. "Why?" Robert asked. "People buy used stoves at auctions, inherit them with houses, and just put them where the previous stove was," Frank explained. "Nobody checks if it's safe, nobody thinks to ask until there's a fire." They went back to work. Frank showed Tom exactly how to install the asbestos board backing, creating a heat shield with an air gap that would let hot air flow up and out instead of building against the wall. They added sheet metal over that, then carefully measured as they moved the stove back into position. 8 inches of clearance this time. Frank used a level to make sure the stove sat perfectly flat. Then they reconnected the stovepipe with tight joints and proper clearance through the ceiling thimble. Frank had Tom light a small fire to test the draw. Smoke went cleanly up the pipe and out through the roof. No leaks, no problems. "There," Frank said. "That's how it should be. You could run this stove 24 hours a day and that wall will stay cool enough to touch." Martha felt tears prick her eyes with relief. Their home was safe. Their children were safe. The knot of fear that had been sitting in her chest since dawn finally loosened. Tom shook hands with Frank, then with Harold and Lars. "I can't thank you enough, all of you." "That's what neighbors are for," Harold said. "You do the same for us." Frank packed up his tools and left them with pamphlets about farmhouse fire safety. "Read these," he said seriously. "Check every other heat source in this house, your heating stoves, the chimney, everything. And Tom, talk to your neighbors. Share what happened here. A lot of folks have the same problem and don't even know it." "I will," Tom promised. After everyone left, Martha cooked dinner on the newly positioned cook stove. It felt different somehow, safer, as if those 8 inches of space represented more than just physical distance. It represented knowledge passed down, mistakes learned from, lives saved because somebody took the time to care. That evening, after the children were in bed, Tom and Martha sat at the kitchen table with the pamphlets Frank had left. One said, "Farmhouse fires killed more than 200 people a year in rural America. Most of those deaths preventable through proper installation and maintenance of heating equipment." "We almost became one of them," Martha said quietly. Tom reached across the table and took her hand. "But we didn't. You caught it in time. We fixed it. We're safe now." "Because I happened to smell something that morning. What if I hadn't? What if the fire had started at night while we were all asleep?" Tom had no answer for that, because they both knew what would have happened. Fire spreads fast in old farmhouses with their dry wood and open stairwells. Minutes maybe, to get 5 people out in the dark. Martha never forgot the smell of that February morning, the grey wisp of smoke, the sickening realization of how close they had come. She never forgot the feel of the charred wood under her fingers, still warm, still dangerous. And she never forgot the relief of watching that stove move to safety, of knowing her children would sleep secure without a silent threat smoldering below them. The Monarch cookstove served them faithfully for another 20 years, always maintaining its 8 inches of clearance. And Martha made sure to teach her children what she had learned, what the old-timers had always known. You always leave space behind the stove, not because it looks better or creates storage, but because heat needs room to dissipate. Because wood burns, because your children sleep upstairs and your life's work is built into the walls around you. That space behind the stove. 8 inches of empty air that meant everything. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you found this story educational and engaging, please subscribe to our channel for more content about American agricultural history and the wisdom of rural farm life. Hit that like button and share this video with anyone interested in learning about the practical knowledge that kept farm families safe. Your support helps us preserve these important stories from America's farming heritage. This video is inspired by real events and actual farming practices from 1930s through 1970s rural America. It is not intended to represent or offend any specific individuals or families. Martha and Tom Anderson are representative characters whose experiences reflect the real situations faced by hundreds of American farming families during this era who dealt with similar challenges regarding farmhouse safety and the proper installation of wood-burning cook stoves.